Buckle up, Camp Pros, and get ready to launch into the future of summer camp with Camp Ahead. Camp Ahead helps Camp Pros think about the future so they're not caught off guard. Climate mitigation, heat, gender, war, demographics, economics, artificial intelligence. Are we ready as an industry? Camp Ahead, exploring the futurology of the summer camp industry. You can find our contact information and the many show notes from each episode at gocamp.pro/campahead.
Is creating your camp schedule a headache? Does it limit the experience of campers or staff? Campify is the software that does the heavy lifting for you, taking care of group, elective, and specialist scheduling based on your custom scheduling rules. Interested in learning more? Visit campify.io/campahead to schedule a demo or create a free trial today. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Camp Ahead. This is our first inaugural voyage in the Camp Ahead podcast. My name is Joe Richards. I'll be one of your co-hosts. I'm currently the executive director at Pierce Williams Summer Camp and Retreat Facility in southwestern Ontario, Canada, and we're located about halfway between Detroit and Toronto.
Hey there, I'm Jess Elfring-Roberts, and I'm the executive director of Episcopal Camps and Conference Centers, which is an organization of a little over 110 Episcopal camps, conference centers, retreat centers, and farms across the United States, and some in Europe and some in South America.
Hi, everybody. My name is KJ Williams. I am the camp director and chief program officer at Phantom Lake YMCA Camp in McGuanago, Wisconsin.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
What is Camp Ahead? And this is our opportunity to share with you. So Camp Ahead is a podcast that will explore something called future scenarios. So essentially not future-proofing your camp, but helping you think differently about the future to help us as things arise, for us to be better prepared to handle them and have a more creative look at how to handle them. A lot of this comes from this book that I'm holding up to the screen right now. It's called Imaginable: How to Create a Hopeful Future in Your Own Life, Your Community, and the World. It is by Jane McGonigal. It will be in the show notes. In fact, I will probably mention the book in every show we ever do, however long this goes on. I wanted to set up a couple of things first. So Jane McGonigal works at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. And the first time I mentioned that, so I was on another podcast for years called Camp Hacker. And the first time I mentioned the Institute for the Future to my Camp Hacker co-hosts, one of them's, that's not a real thing. And I was like, oh, yes. And it's been a real thing since the 70s or 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea that if we don't think about the future, we're not going to be ready to get it. And in reading the book and in listening to Institute things and joining an open community that was present, it's now closed, for the concept of future planning, I have been fascinated by the idea that we really need to make sure as camps and as an industry that we are ready for something else to happen. And a lot of this stems from the pandemic, which is only, right, for, what is that, 3 years ago? 4 years ago? 4 years ago. And so to set the stage, where were you during the pandemic, and how did the pandemic affect where you were at the time?
I was teaching high school theater, and also my wife and I had just found out we were pregnant with our second child in that March of 2020. And so I remember being home and trying to figure out how to do online learning live. We didn't do at the time. It was synchronously, and to theater. How do you teach theater to 40 turned off camera screens? And so that was an epic adventure. And so I spent a lot of time thinking, okay, I've got to try something different to make this work in that time. And so there was a lot of thinking on my feet and thinking, okay, if I've got students at home, how do I keep them engaged? What is something that they can do at home while still using like acting techniques? And so I taught them how to edit videos on their cell phone, and they made like we had a short film festival, which ended up being really fun.
KJ, what were you up to during the pandemic or when it started?
I was working in homeless services in the height of the pandemic, which was and is always needed, but was especially needed. I was living in
Yeah.
downtown Phoenix, Arizona, in 120 degree Fahrenheit heat, and it was challenging. I was running a community center at long-term housing for some folks, and we
Hmm.
had to go from how are we running programs and bringing people together in the community to now how do I serve this community that doesn't have access to internet. It was challenging, and so we really focused on the food insecurities and providing meals to folks at the bare minimum, but it was definitely a major switch in the social service community to how are we going to socially serve people when we don't have the face-to-face option to do that for years.
Yeah, and myself as a camp person, right? It hits, and then you can't run camp. And for a lot of what we do in the camp community is build community, and a lot of that, if not most, all of it is through interactions in person. And if we're not interacting in person, like just trying to do it over Zoom, and lots of camps pivoted to doing, and we did do too, some either camp in a box, right? Mailing
Yep.
stuff out to people and doing camp. We did camp in a bucket because we had 5 gallon buckets lying around that we could pack things in and deliver. Um, but it was a huge challenge to try and adapt to something that I don't think any of us had thought about.
Hmm.
And that's really the key to this future scenario planning, is that we're going to bring, hopefully over the next 8 episodes is our goal for season 1. Over the next 8 episodes, we'll create some scenarios that then we can feel free to play with the camp community and people who want to play. Yeah, because had we thought ahead, what would we have done differently?
I think
Right.
there's this big, I notice it a lot with young adults now, but this big idea of how do I become proactive versus reactive? And if I can learn how to do that in planning for my day, oh, am I going to be out this whole entire day? Do I need to bring a change of clothes? If I can do it in that short amount of time, what does it look like when I'm thinking about the options or things that could happen at my summer camp? How do I be proactive about it now when I have the brain space to do it versus when you're in reaction mode, like we all were during COVID, where you're treading water and you're just trying to do whatever your brain can think of and it's already working in overdrive. And so I love this idea of sitting down and saying, how do I plan for future scenarios that may or may not happen?
Yeah, and as the token young adult on this podcast, right? I'm in my 20s, in my late
Token,
20s.
not token, not token.
I-
Thank you, not
Specifically,
token.
specifically chosen.
The intentional young adults on this podcast, right? How do we also teach even seasonal staff to do that same thing, right? How do we teach them to come back 10 years from now or 2 years from now or whatever it is and do that intentional future scenario planning?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's everybody. I'm also 38 and I'm still learning every day.
Right?
I am, if we're all saying that, I'm a 51 and I know it all. So I'm
Thank
good.
you for getting
Um,
vulnerable on the first episode with
Yeah.
us.
I think the key is, I love the idea of proactive versus reactive. We here at Pierce Williams, we do Clifton Strengths with our staff every couple of summers. And my number one strength in their, or my number one talent in their list of 30, 34, 32 is strategic thinking. So I often go through these things without the idea of doing it on purpose,
Mhm.
right? Like I was having this conversation with my wife the other night. I said, do you think about what happens like when you're late and I don't know where you are, and I'm not going to look up where your phone is because that's creepy as all get out.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, so what if she's been in a horrible car accident? And then I planned life from there. And I mentioned that to some of my staff here, and they're like, that would cause me so much anxiety. As well, I think it's actually a bomb for anxiety, right? Like a bomb being BALM,
Yep.
not BOMB. But
Yep.
like because what you start to know some of those things that you would have to do.
I love how positive you are in the way you're shaping that. I do that, but I call it just worst case scenarioism, where my brain just goes to the worst case. And you're like, oh,
Yeah.
this is great. I'm just going to plan for this future. And I'm like, Okay, so if everybody in my life dies, then what do I do?
Yeah, I like the take on positive spiraling. That's
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. So, as we've mentioned where we are age wise, I'm also firmly in what we would call the generation of X. And this ability to not really, I was telling my staff this summer that because now you both work in the camping world, and our staff who are the same age they were 10 years ago, right? So for us at Pierce, they're somewhere between 16 and 22.
Mhm.
But 16 to 22-year-olds now are very different than 16 to 22-year-olds 15 years ago. And one of the things I mentioned to like this podcast in the office here, we have 4 permanent staff members. And our age goes from me as the 50-year-old to we have a 41-year-old, we have a 30-year-old, and we have a 22-year-old. And it's just a really interesting way to look at the world when you have 4 very different perspectives and almost different generations. But I was saying to my camp director who wanted everything to be perfect, because who doesn't want everything to be perfect, that I can explain Gen X in one, for the most part, I can explain Gen X in one short story, which is that we were all built up. They were going to put a teacher in space. We were super excited. And every classroom had teacher in space like for weeks prior. And on the day of this space shuttle launch, we all gather in our classroom. We're in the gym for some schools. We watch the space shuttle launch. We watch the space shuttle explode. And then we go back to class. It just, okay, take out your math textbooks. And we're like, okay, great. Because that was just the way. There was no, because I don't think adults had any other sort of way to sort of think through that. But that explains Gen X to a huge degree, is that you're just like, well, let's move on to the next thing. And if we ever need to process that thing that happened, we'll do that much later so that it affects future generations.
I was born on January 30th, which was 2 days after the Challenger exploded.
Wow.
My mom's, I was in the hospital and they just kept replaying it over and over again while I was in labor. And I was
Yeah.
like, cool, that's how I was born.
That's how trauma gets introduced for generations. A few things about the book Imaginable as we go into this topic. And I just want to be upfront with everybody who's listening. I did before I brought Jess and KJ on board, a whole bunch of research, and then had ChatGPT and AI help me do research and sort of plan out a schedule. And so we have a schedule that is very much planned out by ChatGPT. But one of the other things I've done is in numerous conversations with various AIs, is I've asked for tidbits about the book Imaginable. And the one ChatGPT has a summarized PDF book article, web and text code in its GPTs. And there's a couple of the quotes that really spoke to me for this first episode, which is that when we imagine the future, we're engaging in a form of mental time travel that helps us make better decisions today. And that's a direct quote from the book. And that's really what we're doing, because for camps, and I don't know how you two feel, but for young people, especially at camps, KJ, when they get a directing role, oftentimes they're thinking about this summer or next summer, and it takes a lot to think, well, how is this decision going to affect 10 years down the line or 15 years down the line?
Yeah.
And so this time travel will allow us to be somewhere else momentarily that's not here, and also not concerned about, will my contract be renewed in the next 6 months? And so so for us, I want you two to really play into this idea of mental time travel and putting ourselves 10 years out.
So I think kind of to jump on that, if you haven't read the book and you're like, I don't understand what you're talking about, like, we're not talking about Back to the Future or something like this. It's an exercise that you can do to kind of put yourself in a place that's not where you usually are. And there's a great exercise to just practice, what does this actually mean? And so you can close your eyes if you want to, and you can think about like tomorrow. All right, tomorrow morning when you wake up, what are you going to do? What's the weather going to be like? What's X, Y, and Z? And it really asks you to engage your senses, your five senses. And that helps you to really paint the picture, your brain to connect these things about tomorrow. And so if you can do that, if you can plan out tomorrow, you've done time traveling in this idea, but in a very short way. And when you go into this book, it helps you to think through doing that same exercise, but thinking 10 years. What does it look like 10 years from now for you to wake up? But there's a lot more questions that come
Yeah.
up when you're thinking
Yeah.
about 10 years from now versus tomorrow, because we all have a somewhat of a routine when we wake up. And so you know what that looks like. But what is your routine going to be 10 years from now?
Well, and where are you waking up? KJ, as a
Mhm.
young person, 10 years from now can be a very different place for you.
You'll be
It's-
old.
Yeah, it seems like a different world, right? Yeah.
Where would you like? So let's do this out loud. We're all by coming on as a co-host, we're going to ask crazy questions. Let's do this out loud with KJ. Let's see. So in 10 years, what do you think from this moment in time? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Physically.
Yeah, I mean,
let's go with a physical place first.
physically, I live on camp. I would love to potentially still be living on camp, just in a nicer home. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard concept, right? To even think about 10 years from now.
Mhm.
Like my 30s, man. Uh,
Okay.
just kidding. But yeah, I think physically, I see myself still in Wisconsin, probably closer to the city, if not on camp. That would be my physical state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you're still on camp, you're still working for camp.
Yeah, I think so. This was the plan all along, and the goal would be in 10 years, I see myself taking over as executive director, CEO, most likely of the same camp, of this camp. That's where I can see myself at this current moment in time. Yeah.
Yeah. And then as I will tell you, life happens around you
Totally.
and changes can happen but I also say that as someone who's lived on camp at Pierce Williams since 2005. So I just finished my 20th summer here, and this is a hard part. And I don't know how you two would like. The hard part for me when I do this future thinking is I like where I am.
Mhm.
Right.
Right. So, but also now, especially as a 51-year-old, and as my wife is going to, be able to retire in 5 years, 4.5 years. And then it starts to become, what does 10 years from now look like for me? Because if I don't live on camp, then where do I live? Because I don't have a house,
Mhm.
right? What do we do? Do I still live on camp when my wife retires?
Mhm.
Do I still do camp for that length of time?
One of the things that when I'm thinking about future planning and I can't answer those questions, I'm like, I don't know, a bigger house. And then it's, well, how many floors? Like how many rooms? How many bedrooms? How many people are living in it? And I can't get there. I pause and I go back to what are Jess, what are my values? What do I value as a human being? And like for me, in my life, that's authenticity, joy, inclusion, and creativity. And so if I know that these are things that I always carry with me, I know that the choices that I make in my life will always go back to what I value. And so I always kind of think about that. So if I'm thinking like, oh, 10 years from now, I'm going to be a millionaire and I'm going to live in a mansion, I think, does that align with my values? Because if it doesn't, I'm not going to go there because that's not at the core of who I am. And so I often, if I can't think and I get stuck, I go back to who am I? And then also there are things in my life, like I have a wife and I have 2 kids. I have 2 daughters. And so like I have a 9-year-old and almost 4-year-old. And so in 10 years, one of them will be 19 and one will be almost 14. And then I'm like, oh my, I don't know how to plan for that. And as somebody who was like a youth minister for 20 years, it's different when they're not your kids.
Right.
And so that for me is the hardest thing, is planning for the future when there are lots of things, and this is what it's all about, that are not in your control. But what are you in control of, and how can you or your values affect the way that you engage with other people or your family or your community or your camp?
I love that idea of using values as your essentially what I would call your foundation, right?
Mhm.
Many, many years ago, when I was in university, I hitchhiked out west for the summer job in between first and second year university. And I had this philosophy that the farther west I went, the lower down people's moral values went. It was a weird, and I thought about it last year because I did a sabbatical and I drove Route 66. So as I'm
Nice.
driving to Santa Monica Pier, I was like, I don't think the same way now that I did in my 20s.
Mhm.
But I think more so, it was this idea of, is my foundation good enough to
Mhm.
to work away from where everybody who helped build it is, right? Be it family, be
Yeah.
it camp people, be it friends. Because when you remove yourself from all of those things, will your foundation withstand the storms that are going to happen?
Oof.
Right.
That's a big question. Summer camp directors, listen up. What if I told you there was a magical tool that could transform your camp scheduling chaos into a breeze? Introducing Campify, a camp scheduling platform making scheduling as fun as camp itself. Before you hit skip, hear us out. Campify isn't just another app, it's your new secret weapon to conquer scheduling chaos. Camps across North America wish they tried it sooner, and none would ever go back to scheduling the old-fashioned way. Every camp is unique and it has its own special quirks. Campify gets that, and it works and thinks for you. It builds schedules based on rules that you set, and Campify offers much more than group scheduling. Campify's elective module gives campers personalized schedules. Say goodbye to last-minute changes causing scrambling and confusion. Campify's staff mobile app updates schedules in real time. Your time is valuable. Let Campify save you hours and make the scheduling effortless. Bring your camp into the future and discover the smarter way to schedule. Visit campify.io/campahead to schedule a demo. Create a free trial and claim 10% off your first year's license. The idea of mental time travel is super important, right? That we're gonna put ourselves somewhere else. And I love the fact that you talked about details and who I am, but for some of these scenarios, it's not more or less of anything, but so I'll talk about a scenario that I did with the Institute for the Future. So I did something called Zerotopia. So this should help people who are listening understand what a scenario looks like. The scenario is that your local municipality, all municipalities will stop accepting garbage. Now, they've prepared you for this. They've told you about this. They will still take compost, but they won't take garbage or recycling or plastics. It's just compost they're going to take. And there's now a 2,000% tax or 200% tax, I forget but on reusable on single-use containers. So if you go to Starbucks and you want a coffee and you forgot your cup, that $2 coffee, I know that's not realistic at Starbucks, but let's use it for simple math, now becomes a $20 cup of coffee because you are getting a single-use cup. And in this scenario, 10 years out, I was playing it with a group of people who were not all camp people, which is a great thing because I had a different perspective than someone who approached this from a teaching lens or someone who approached this from a future of municipal politics lens. And I think that's one of the things that as we move towards scenario building, really need to focus on different people in camping. Age groups is one, as well as including the people like your maintenance guy at camp, right? To figure out these things. And so what that scenario looked like was 5 to 7 days with a prompt each morning to ask you to think about, it would give you a little story prompt about Zerotopia. And then you would have to write a little reflection on it, like 15 minutes. It's meant to be done in less than 15 minutes of your day. But what it does is it forces all day long, my brain thinks about, oh, well, that wouldn't be able to happen in that future because we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing right now in the future and so it really focused me on, well, how do we deal with garbage now at camp, Like, how do we
Mhm.
train people to understand that they can't just bring we're on municipal water. Municipal water in Canada is safe to drink more times than not. But there's still groups who bring bottled water. And we have a huge aversion to bottled water because then you're producing all of these
Mhm.
plastic bottles. And so do you outlaw bottled water? Do you make them take recycling with them when they go? Right? Do you limit the number of currently we've gone with limiting the amount of garbage they can produce while they're here, right? So we say it's 1 bag per 10 participants per a weekend, right? So if you have 50 participants, we should only have 5 bags of garbage at the end. I was just at Camp Fowler in Upper New York in the Adirondacks, and they have a separate garbage bin for all of their paper towels because you can compost paper
Mhm.
towels, right, and then they have But it was fascinating to think through and see how it affected your day to day things, even for that, and not just for that week, because then I think about Zerotopia all the time, and that was like 10 months ago.
I think maybe what would be helpful is to explain the idea of scenario planning,
Hmm.
just so if people have never done this before, right? And you gave like such a good example. You take a scenario that could happen, right? Like you said, being charged a really high price for garbage. And then you play that out in how that would work in either your life or your work. And I think camp people are so good at scenario work. I think about any staff training I've ever done, and you're like, okay, that small group, you're going to do this scenario where the camper is homesick, and then they work it out. And I think camp people do a lot of group initiatives or ropes course stuff. And so people know how to work together really, really well. And I think you are building camp folks are so good at this that scenario planning could be a really great place to get really creative and think outside the box of planning for the future.
Yeah. And I think it's also this idea that a lot of times the scenarios that I'm thinking of are not just camp specific,
Mhm.
right? It's easy for us as camp professionals, for KJ and myself who live on site at camps, to think specifically about our facility. And for you, Jess, when you have numerous facilities that you try to treat the same, you love all of your kids just the same. But it's the larger things that actually cause, like, when the hurricanes happened and all of it parked itself over North Carolina in Asheville, which is
Mhm.
so for those who don't know, Asheville, North Carolina, Brevard, North Carolina, which is close to Asheville, within an hour drive, there are 80 summer camps.
Mm.
There is in Brevard, there was I toured these camps in I don't know, 2016 maybe. Not all 80. That'd be ridiculous. There's an ice cream shop in Brevard that has ice cream flavors named after every camp. So on your day off, you can go and get that. But
Mhm.
when it talked about this idea of the flooding, and they used the term that Asheville was a climate haven, which is not something that I had been aware of as a
Mm.
term, right? That people are seeking out these safe places because people understand that changes are happening. And Asheville is now in a climate haven sense. It made me walk around my site and look and be like, what happens if I get a year's worth of rain in a day? And we're recording this on Halloween. And just in the past 2 days, I'm not sure if Americans step out of the election cycle for a second, sections of Spain received a full year's worth of rain in 8 hours.
Mhm.
Like the images are ridiculous of cars just being piled into giant piles by the water. And that all to be said, when we're planning a scenario, I often think, and I would love to hear both of your thoughts on this, that it's better to plan how something bigger affects camp than specifically a camp-based scenario.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think with scenario-based planning, you want to be planning for things that are entirely out of your control. And so much of that is things that happen outside of the camp, outside of the space. I was down in Asheville and visiting with some of our centers, and they couldn't drink the water. There aren't restaurants that are open, and there was a Waffle House, and you could grab food and go. People I think, are still in shock of it happening there. Like you were saying, it's this climate haven. But if it is true that no place is a climate haven, then how do we think through how that affects us?
I feel like when you think big, right? 10-year big planning, it makes those smaller things seem less, and not less in a way where they're not an issue,
Mhm.
but when we plan for something big, I feel like when something smaller but still big happens, it's simpler, right? It's simpler to handle.
It's more manageable. Or
More manageable.
you
Great.
think, "I know how to do this," or "I have an idea, and so when I look at this, I can actually break this down, and I think I can do the steps, easier."
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, because some of those big things, let's make a list. Like what are so environmental is a big thing.
Huge. Sure.
What's another big component to that can affect camps?
Financial. There could be something that happens with your country's finances, so it could be the stock market. It could be all sorts of ways in which that can affect you.
I think about this idea, and this is only from reading Institute for the Future stuff of migration, right? And the fact that what's going to happen as climate changes is you're going to have these migrants who are climate migrants. So you're going to have people from Florida who need to migrate somewhere else. You're going to have people from coastlines who need to migrate to someone else. But it could be a huge thing.
Mm.
It's a bit of a trigger for American politics, and I assume that there'll be a lot of American camp directors who listen to this. I'm a Canadian. I live on the right side of Lake Erie, and it's just one of those things when we talk about migration, it's not just about people moving from country to country. It's
Mhm.
also people within a country moving. And as a Canadian, I think of how much of for those unaware of, I have a geography degree as well. But if you didn't know, I think it's 80 to 90% of the population of Canada lives within 200 kilometers or like 150 miles of the border with the United
Mm.
States. And to the north of that is this giant landmass that as things change will become more habitable
Mhm.
because it will not be as desolate. So
Yeah,
migration, what else we got, KJ?
well, I was just gonna say we're seeing the effects of that, right? Like we're 40 minutes from Lake Michigan, which is the largest freshwater source in the world,
Yeah.
from Phoenix. So I'm a culprit of climate migration myself, right? Without even knowing it. But we're already seeing the effects of that here in my state that I'm in. So yeah, it's gonna be a huge issue.
Well,
Or
and
not a huge issue.
I think politics is a big issue for us as well.
I agree.
Not that I don't want to delve my toe. I've already said too much. People have already shut it off. It's all good. And then I also think about demographics, right? From a camp perspective, for the history of camping, from the late 1800s till now, we've been focused mainly on children and youth.
Mhm.
But as those demographics change, and not just demographics of age, but demographics of the different nationalities who move into, I was recently in Toronto, and there's a ton of different nationalities. As I look around this video, we're all seem to be white and Caucasian. I just want to recognize that. But there are a bunch of Asian, we have a ton of Korean user groups here on site at Pierce Williams that rent us, but they're never going to send their kids to camp because they want to be with family. They believe that family, so there's demographics to think through in those things as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of thinking about the way we do camp, and the way it has been from a white man's point of view since the 1800s. And so if we're thinking about looking at the way we want to do camp, who's at the table making those decisions, right? So if you have a group of people who really focus on the family and wanting to have that, it's like, how cool would it be to do a family camp? And I'm sure you do things like that, or to
Mhm.
just think outside the box of bringing people to the table who maybe have never experienced camp and asking them what they want, or what would they like their experience to be, and having them be a collaborator in that process.
Yeah.
Totally.
And I think all of these things lead to better and different scenarios that we can sort of tackle as we go
Mhm.
forward. And so I've written down environmental, financial, migration, political, demographic, and I'm sure there's more. I would love to, if people just want to let us know. If you ever have something, or you're listening to this and you want to send a message to us, you can send a message directly to me, Joe, Joe, at campisbetter.com. Life is good. Camp is better. And it'll come right into my email box. As we talk about scenario planning from the book Imaginable, the other thing I want to make sure that we're aware of from these pull quotes is that futurists are not in the business of making predictions, Jane says. We are in the business of exploring possibilities. And I went on sabbatical, as I said, last year. And I came back from sabbatical to my board of directors, and I had a lot of time to think. And one of the things I thought through was this idea of the potential future for Pierce Williams, right? Because it's not my job at this moment in time to save all camps, as I say. I'm being paid to save Pierce Williams. But what I wrote was, the future of summer camp and of standalone facilities will be challenging and unclear. It is up to us as stewards of Pierce Williams at this moment in time to have a vision that sees multiple possible futures and then shape that vision to adapt to the realities that change and morph around us. It will be vital for our organization to have someone who's learning, researching, and analyzing what the future will do to Pierce Williams and the challenges it will have for us. To not plan for change in the future is to plan for the failure of Pierce Williams over the next 10 to 25 years.
Yep.
And that's, I'm sure both of you could put camp names in there. I think that this is an industry-wide, I would go as bold as to say that this is an industry challenge, right? Is that as we go through the changes, if we're not figuring out how change is going to affect us, or if we're not mentally time traveling and looking at possibilities, we're going to be left behind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we're getting the opportunity as camps and conference centers and all of those things, like, to pause and reflect and think about it. And if we don't listen to that, and we don't plan, or we don't change, we may lose our camp. We may lose. And so I think there is a piece of doing a reality check on, what does this look like in the future, and sitting down with your board, with your staff, with your stakeholders, and saying, let's spend some time looking at not this year, not the next year, but 5 or 10 years down. So if we're looking at strategic planning, let's look bigger and wider than we originally thought, because we need to be thinking about that. We need to keep that in our peripheries instead of just what's in front of us.
And let's utilize each other. I think camp does this so well, the collaboration. It's not a corporate, we're fighting each other for the money or the kids, or we're battling. Camp is so good at collaborating. So maybe your board or your execs aren't ready for that 5 to 10 year conversation. Who is? Find the people that are, and what are they doing, and how can you be in collaboration with those people?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what this is. That's what the three of us are. So we had asked I hadn't asked numerous people. Full stop there for a second. I had put out an interest, right? Just a single post. I never reposted that post on the Facebook camping group. I just put out a post saying, hey, here's an idea. Let me know if you're interested. And that's where the two of you came from. And 15 other people replied to that post. And it really speaks to this idea that I don't think I'm the only one who thinks about this, but we need to get it started. And that's what today is in this first episode. And that's because we can talk, and we will continue to talk about the specifics of scenario planning and why it matters. But we can also, and sharing anecdotes, the International Camping Fellowship is a group that represents camping organizations from around the world. And so on Tuesday, I was invited to a reception in Castor, Ontario, a little town outside of Hamilton. And the International Camping Fellowship was meeting in the camp offices of Camp Winona there for a board meeting. And so I got to meet people from Japan and China and Turkey and Russia and Canada and the US. And it reminded myself, oh, camping is a much bigger thing than just Pierce Williams.
Mhm.
And I think for a lot of us, if you grow up in the same place, so there's two stories here. When I was a young camp counselor, I grew up at a camp called Kennesary Camp. My parents met at Kennesary Camp. Both of my brothers met their wives at Kennesary Camp. It is my home camp where I grew up. My brother is currently the executive director at Kennesary Camp. This is a family sort of feel. And it is one of the things that happened at Kennesary was that one year, like 88 or 89, we got on a bus on a weekend in June and we came to Pierce Williams. This is well before I knew what Pierce Williams was. And we picked up the Pierce Williams staff. And then we took that bus to Toronto, the big city, and went to Lawrence Park Collegiate, which is a high school. And honest to goodness, there's 20 of us who get on the bus at Kennesary. There's 20 more people who get on the bus at Pierce Williams. We show up at Lawrence Park for the Ontario Camping Association Counselor Conference. And I walk in for the opening keynote to 1,000 to 1,200 other camp counselors in the room from hundreds of other camps. And I think as a young and very impressionable 16-year-old, I was like, oh, like this is much bigger than Kennesary, right? And I still have books sitting on my bookshelf that I bought at that gathering, that one-day gathering. And that's the same way I feel when I go to conferences for international camping things, when you see, or other things. Jess and I sit on another organization council, the outdoor, I can't even think of the name of it right now.
Outdoor
OMC.
Ministries Connection.
So it's all the mainline denomination sort of outdoor ministries getting together, understanding that we are better together and 90 to 95% of what we do is the same. But it's the same. There was a great gathering in the fall of 2019, just before the pandemic, where you had 700 camp people at Lake Junaluska in North Carolina. I'm not saying everybody's thinking about the future, and they're not, because oftentimes the day-to-day things at our own camps, our own facilities, get in the way of thinking too far out. What I'm saying is that when we meet a larger organization, we understand that, or I speak for me, I understand that somebody needs to do this thinking, and somebody needs to coordinate this thinking and help others see the need for it. On Tuesday, when I was at this gathering, there were numerous Ontario people there as well who had asked what I was doing. I'd left the podcast. I just took some time away from Camp Hacker, and they were like, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, oddly enough, I'm working on this future thinking podcast, Camp Ahead." And they're like, and they asked tons of questions about it. They're like, "Okay, how will we know when it comes out?" And I'm like, "Just pay attention." But
we did not plan a future when the podcast came out. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly. We didn't actually have the future. The other short thing I want to say is about 10 years ago, I started using a phrase at camp, and I would encourage all camps to start thinking this way. We use the phrase today's camper's camper. So are the decisions I'm making today good for today's camper's camper, which in my mind is 27 years from now, if you do averages and math, which means if I have a 7-year-old who shows up at camp today, in 20 years at 27, she's going to have a child. This is all just basic averages. I haven't consulted an actuary on any of this. And that child then 7 years later will be able to come to camp. So 27 years from today, are the decisions we're making about camp, are they valid for today's camper's camper, right? Will it ensure that this building is still here in 27 years, that this decision will sit well for 27 years? And it's not something at the beginning, we used it as a reference point, right? Like Somebody could say, well, what about 27 years from now? Which is a weird number to do. But once you know what it is, you're like, oh, what about 27 years from now? And it's a form, before I even read this book, it's a form of a future planning. Did you have any wrap-up thoughts about anything that was in the plan that we didn't get to? KJ, anything that you, or anything you want to finish up with?
I mean, hearing you two talk about something, let me get my thoughts in order. I work for the YMCA, right? Massive global organization that I would say is pros in the camp industry, right? They've got it figured out. And I'm going to bring it back to this collaboration piece, but we get so caught up in the Y world, in the Y camping world, and I'm just really honored to be talking to people who are professionals in camping that are not in the Y world and not affiliated with that association. And I think even in camping, we still have our bubbles, right? There's the religious camps, there's the Girl Scout camps, there's the Y camps, whatever it is. And my advice or my desire is to step out of that bubble to really have these conversations. And so I'm excited going forward to get some new perspective,
Mm.
because when it really comes down to it, I think the goal of all of us in camping is the same, right? Creating a safe, positive, fun, life-changing environment for kids. And so I'm excited to see different perspectives and collaborate on how that'll look going forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that I often spend a week I'll go to a whole session of a camp as a chaplain or as a visitor. Instead of just going for a day when I come and I'm visiting, I immerse myself and get to play and do all the fun things that that camp has. And really what it has done for me in my life, and also as my role in supporting and advocating for all of our centers, is it's giving me this new perspective, right? Because I worked at a camp for almost 20 years. My wife and I fell in love there. Our eldest has gone to camp there, and that's the best camp in the world, right? That one. And then I go and I visit another camp and I spend a session there and I get to meet campers and I get to meet staff who were campers. I meet staff whose parents were staff. And that's the best camp in the world. And then I go into another one and it's the same thing. And when I hear people telling their stories and you see this look in their eyes of this, it's like this, it's made a profound impact.
Totally.
And it's hit a core memory that's going to be with them forever. And I, in my role, for some reason, get to experience these things. And people are sharing their special place in the entire world with me. And then I think about these conversations, and I love that idea, KJ, you're just talking about like getting outside of our best camp in the entire world, right?
Right.
Or our best association in the entire world, and opening those silos and being able to share and collaborate and dream and plan together. Because you're right, like if our goal is to have at our core a safe place for kids to explore and learn and grow, we can do that together at its core. And we can share our gifts and we can share our hopes and dreams and the things that work and the things that didn't. It's only going to make us better.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I'm
Yeah.
excited to do this with you all.
I'm really glad that this first episode has gone what I believe to be as well as it has. We did have an episode 0 that we didn't record where we got on a Zoom and we chatted. There are two things. There's probably more. You've probably realized by now I have zero control over stuff. I want us to, in my mind, I would expand it beyond kids, right?
Oh, for sure.
We ran a 55 plus camp a couple of weeks ago for the first time ever. Oh my God, gold mine.
Cool.
Gold mine in creating community, not just funds, not just people coming, but I realized sitting in a room at 10 o'clock at night, listening to, well, probably 9:30 at night, listening to a guy who said he was going to play guitar for an hour, reach into his 2.5 hour limit. And he wasn't even he was just somebody had invited to come. And I was watching everybody dance and whatnot. I was like, all we're doing here is providing a place for people to create community.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. And
Yeah.
all I'm doing go ahead, Jess.
No, you're so right. I never went to camp as a kid.
Oh yeah.
I never I never had that experience, and I did go to a super conservative day camp, and that experience made me say, "I'm never gonna go to camp ever again." But I realized I was just like, "I wanna go to camp. I wanna have that experience, but I also don't want, as a staff member, to make camp about me, because that's not my job." And so there is this, you're right, there is this need, this want, this for not just kids, but all ages. And I think you're right, it's that sense of community and it's having this place of belonging. And so I'm glad you said that.
It's huge. And I love, KJ, you said getting out of a bubble, right? Because
Right.
it's so often, and that's what walking into 1,000 other camp counselors does in a time before the internet, right? Where you have no concept of, I still remember my my farmer father saying, "You can work at camp full time." I was like, "I don't
Mm.
know, but I'm going to go into outdoor recreation because that's what I want to do." And what I love about what I think for this group, for the three of us, I treat this a lot like a mastermind group. And if people don't know what a mastermind group, it's this idea of getting together with 3 or 4 other camp professionals every once a month or every couple of weeks, just chatting through our challenges, our problems, our just getting a different perspective. And on Tuesday, when I was at the International Camping Congress reception, Gab Rail, who is a longtime friend, almost a 30-year friend, and we were on Camp Hacker together for 15 years. She's there in person, and I'm like, for sure, I'm hanging out with Gab tonight. This is what I'm doing. But it reminds me of how important it is to have people to talk to sort of flesh out ideas and see where we're going. And that's really what this is for me personally, is this idea that I just think we as a camp industry need to think about the future more. And this is my way of being like, let's do that.
Love it.
I'm going to end with I'm going to give you two a couple of things. I want you to bring out the one thing that most surprised you about, or the one thing you're going to think about after you get off this call. And we'll do that on every call. So the one thing that was sort of brought up today, I'm going to read a couple of the other quotes, pull quotes from Imaginable by Jane. More vivid our mental simulations of the future, the more emotionally prepared we are for unexpected events. And Jess, you talked about that in the details. Details can be important. And by imagining a wide range of future possibilities, we can expand our capacity to respond to uncertainty, because the world is all about uncertainty, and we're just expanding that. So what were some of the things that you are going to still think about after we leave today?
One of the things that popped into my mind, and I'm not giving homework at all, but was to ask the question, does your camp's mission or your organization's mission allow for scenario planning, for future planning? So take a look at your mission, what drives you, and does that allow for it? Or is it kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but
Limiting?
there's the word. Yeah. Does
Yeah.
your mission allow you to help plan for the future, or is it limiting?
It's a good one. Did anything come up for you, KJ?
Yeah, the terminology you used, Joe, was today's campers got me thinking, right? When we talk about future scenario planning, what is within my control seems simpler to think about for future scenarios than what isn't, right?
Yeah.
The annual campaign's budget, not in my control at this time. So I can't even imagine what to do with that. But the training the staff for 10 years from now, and the way they're going to interact with these kids, that's within my control. So that today's camper really got me thinking about moving forward, what is within my control when looking at future scenario planning.
Yeah. And just to build on that a little bit, KJ, is this idea that you're training the staff not just to work with those kids, you're training those staff to be amazing people outside of camp.
Completely.
And Jess said that's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. In fact, during our 55 plus retreat, one of our previous board chairs came back and led like a scrapbooking, journal making, card making thing. And her daughters both worked at camp under me. And she said that Poof still curses me to this day Because one of the philosophies we have here at Pierce Williams is this idea of to do what needs to be done, which is to do what needs to be done to give the campers the most amazing camp experience. That's our job description for everybody. And it's the top line. It's not like other duties as required. It's the top line. And Poof said that in every job she's in, it just makes her more pissed off at her other people who don't follow the same philosophy. I think for me, I think the big thing I took away was early on, Jess, you mentioned proactive versus reactive. And I really want to make sure that we and our listeners understand that that's what the goal of this is, that we can become people who are more proactive. And we're not saying we're not predicting the future. We're just playing with possibilities so that when possibilities arrive, we feel better about making decisions because we've already made those decisions mentally in a scenario or some form of that decision. And I think that's where we can be more proactive in making ourselves more comfortable and less anxious about the future. Yeah.
Sounds good. You can subscribe to our podcast.
Yes. And if you really like this first episode, you can send us a review. That would be awesome. I'm sure some editor somewhere. Thank you to whoever is editing our podcast. We are part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network. And our goal is to have 8 episodes out before next May is the goal. So we'll go from there. Where can people, if people want to ask a question, KJ, where can people find you or find out more about camp?
Yeah, you can find out about Phantom Lake YMCA Camp at phantomlakeymca.org. Same on Instagram, Facebook, all of those fun things. Or you can email me directly at kj@phantomlakeymca.org.
And why do I always, do you spell phantom with a PH or with an F?
Phantom with a PH.
I'm just imagining your logo right now without looking, and I really hope there's a ghost.
I wish it was cooler. I wish.
Especially on a Halloween recording. Come on.
Right. KJ
Jess,
spelled KJ, Phantom spelled PH.
Jess, where can people find you?
You can find me on our Episcopal Camps and Conference Center website, which is episcopalccc.org. episcopalccc.org. And my email is jess@episcopalcc.org. We're on all of the things, all of the socials.
Awesome. That's great. And mine is just Joe, Joe, at campisbetter.com. Life is good, camp is better. That's where you can find out about Pierce Williams. You can reach and touch base. If you want to follow me on social, so Pierce Williams is on social media everywhere as Camp is Better. And there is a Joe Richards TikTok account that's called Camp Yo-Yo Joe, YOYOJOE, that I have not posted to in the past couple of months, but there's lots of good things there about camp and things. So we'll get to that. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being part of this journey as we begin. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Camp Ahead, exploring the futurology of the summer camp industry. Don't forget to check out our contact information and show notes at gocamp.pro/campahead. Camp Ahead is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network. Find a podcast for camp pros of every age and stage at gocamp.pro/podcast. Hey Camp Pros, we love that our industry is built on sharing. In order to foster that spirit, we ask that whenever you get something great from a conference session, one of these podcasts, from the Camp Pros group on Facebook, wherever else, that you give credit where credit is due. That way, people can feel comfortable about sharing their best practices and continue to make all of our camps better. Thanks so much.